Dunsany is one of James's favorite authors, and one that's particularly meaningful to him. We will fully admit that Dunsany could have easily just been included in our recent Forgotten Foundations episodes, but James feels like that would be doing Dunsany an injustice. Given that he influenced Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, Arthur C. Clarke and Jorge Luis Borges, Gene Wolfe, Tolkien, Michael Moorcock, Ursula K. Le Guin, David Eddings, Peter Beagle, even Guillermo del Toro and Neil Gaiman, we think he deserves more than a paragraph in this overview. We're gonna give Lord Dunsany his own episode. A young man is born into one of the oldest peerages in Ireland. He will become a man of service, a man of letters, a man torn between his love of Ireland and his love of the crown. His youth was filled with the peaceful idyls of noble life, but like many of his station, that peace was broken when he was called upon to serve in the Boer War. He took up arms in the Coldstream Guards and shipped off to Africa, where he became fast friends with a fellow named Rudyard Kipling, who he would exchange letters and discuss story ideas with for decades. By the time he had returned from the war, though, the world had changed. Ireland was coming into its own within the empire. Literature and art were flourishing. And it's in this new Irish Renaissance that the young man we've been following, one Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, the 18th Baron of Dunsany, became friends with the foremost literary voices of his country. Great names like Padraig Colum and W.B. Yeats, who would later go on to collate and publish some of his work. And it was in this flourishing of Irish thought and art that he decided to dedicate himself to literature. He threw himself at it avidly, publishing stories in the local papers whenever he could, until in 1905 he decided to take a gamble on himself and pay for the publication of his first full-length work, The Gods of Pegana. It was an instant success, and a milestone in the history of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. It was praised by critics for its novelty, because it truly did something new. It created a mythos. Dunsany drew on the three favorite sources of his youth, the Greeks, Poe, and the King James Bible, to create a world of his own, with its own pantheon and its own history. He took the style of King James, the uncanny supernaturalism of Poe, and the lush, fully realized mixing of history and the divine that the Greeks offered, and put it all together in his own unique work. It really was the first complete modern mythos, and it was devoured by future authors ranging from Lovecraft to Tolkien. The next year, Dunsany followed up on this success with a book called Time and the Gods, an expansion to his world of Pegana. And then he moved into human stories, releasing tale after tale set in Pegana that expanded on the doings of the realm's human inhabitants. Then, the First World War began. Now in his mid-30s, Dunsany was stationed back, away from the action, serving as a trainer and a captain for the Royal Inniskilling Fusiliers. One day in 1916, while he was on leave and taking dinner with George Bernard Shaw, whose legendary cantankerousness Dunsany always maintained was just an act, as Shaw was very kind about Dunsany's work, the conversation turned to the troubles in Ireland. A scant 2 weeks later, those troubles would prove all too real. Hour by hour, news reached his house. Something's happening in Dublin. The trains are stopped. There's shooting in the streets. Then an armored car pulled up to the great Dunsany estate, and a brigadier general who was staying at Dunsany's house was told that he had to leave. Now. Something major was happening. Dunsany hopped in his own car and raced to Dublin. It was the Easter Uprising. The rebel army intercepted his vehicle. The car screeched to a halt. For a moment, everything was still. Then the car was enveloped in a hail of fire. Bullet after bullet ricocheted off the street. Dunsany's driver was forced back behind the car door. Dunsany himself dropped to the ground. The road was torn up all around him. Something hit him in the face. He was bleeding. He had to make a run for it. He dashed towards a doorway for cover, bullets trailing him all the way. His military belt was torn from him, left lying in the street. Now faint from blood loss, Dunsany was taken prisoner by a man with a bayonet. The wound in his head was gruesome. He was sent to a hospital serviced by the local nuns. For a week he lay there, listening to the machine gun fire. Then the shelling, as the British army rolled into the city. When the British forces retook the hospital, a doctor was finally able to see him and immediately decided to operate. There was a bullet lodged very close to his brain. The doctor kept a piece of Dunsany's skull as a souvenir and handed Dunsany the bullet to keep. And his belt? The legendary Irish revolutionary leader Michael Collins was buried with it as a trophy of war. In the interwar years, Dunsany took to writing plays. He would act them out with his children, romping around the house to make sure they were just right. He was experimenting with a new form, radio plays, stories that could never be performed in a theater. And just like his Pagana stories, these were a smash success. It was around this time that he first toured America, stopping by Rhode Island where he met an avid young fan, one H.P. Lovecraft, who would later lament that he was only capable of writing Poe stories and Dunsany stories, but didn't even know what a real Lovecraft story was. In 1924, Dunsany was sent to Czechoslovakia as part of a delegation of authors, including H.G. Wells, who he had known for years, although he and Wells never got along very well. Not for like a good reason, but just because every time Wells stayed over, Dunsany always beat him in cricket and billiards. In fact, Dunsany was also a great gamesman. He played one of the greatest chess masters in history to a draw. He invented a new chess variant. He became the pistol-shooting champion of Ireland, and when not doing these things, or writing even more books, he campaigned against animal cruelty. And somewhere in there, right around the time of his trip to Czechoslovakia, he found the time to write what, today, is probably his most famous novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter. It takes the ethereal, mythical quality of his short stories and stretches it out to a full-length book. It was this work that made Arthur C. Clarke declare Dunsany one of the greatest writers of the century. And while, in my opinion, like Lovecraft, Dunsany's strength was in his shorter work, The King of Elfland's Daughter certainly paved the way for much of the fantasy genre that would follow. From there, he went off to teach in Athens, only to have a wild adventure getting back when the Italians invaded Greece. Too old for active service in World War II, Dunsany volunteered to be part of the Home Guard, and ended up in the hardest-hit part of England during the Battle of Britain, working tirelessly to organize the civilians and manage the defense. After the war ended, Dunsany's novels took on a bit of a grimmer tone, showing some of the disappointment these two world wars brought. These post-war novels offer a lament for the promise of science and industry turned, as he saw it, towards nothing but mechanization and destruction. And as his life came to a close, he was working on a post-apocalyptic novel with many parallels to After London, but this one warning of the dangers of the atom bomb. During Dunsany's lifetime, F. Scott Fitzgerald had a character quote his poetry, and Jorge Luis Borges included him in a compilation of fantastic stories for the Spanish-speaking world. But it's Dunsany's lasting influence that brings him up in this series today. Lord Dunsany is the father of fantasy, and the father of mythos, hugely popular in his time, and one of the most influential genre writers of the 20th century. And it's really a crime that his works are so nearly forgotten today. All modern myth-making and world-building are his descendants. From the flowing worlds of Tolkien to the ecology of Dune, from the horror of Lovecraft to the wastes of the Dark Tower. Directly or indirectly, they all owe a debt to Dunsany. If this extra sci-fi series ends up achieving anything, I hope that it's giving Dunsany's work a chance to inspire another generation. We'll see you next time.